I would like to introduce Davis Bates, who will read tonight's land acknowledgement. Davis is an alum from Fall 73. He's also a parent from Fall 16. He's on the 50th anniversary steering committee and the AAG, and he plants daffodils on campus, and he wears many hats, most of them pink baseball caps. So Davis, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us here today. We want to begin by naming that the college is on unceded Pecumtuck land. We understand that naming this is not enough. We're doing this as a way of acknowledging and reminding ourselves about the land we occupy. And we know that this act alone does not repair the damage done by colonialism. We want to acknowledge the Pecumtuck people, the original inhabitants of the land where we live and work, and the land that Hampshire College is on. This land spans from what is currently known as Hampden and Hampshire counties into Connecticut and southern Vermont. While there are still individuals with Pecumtuck ancestry here, the Pecumtuck people as a tribe are no longer here because of the ongoing violence at the hands of European colonialization. We'd also like to acknowledge the neighboring indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohican and Nonotuck to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. To learn more about this history, I want to encourage you to read Dr. Lisa Brooks' new book called Our Beloved Kin, A New History of the King Philip's War, which shed light on the powerful and complex history of Native resistance in this area. We know that there are people on this webinar who are joining us from around the US and throughout the world, and we want to encourage you all to learn about the original peoples of the land that you are settled in. A resource that can help you with this is the Native Land app, an Indigenous-led organization, https://native-land.ca/ that we will be putting in the chat. And before we start the program, I want to leave you with a couple questions to reflect on. What can we do individually and collectively to repair the harm done by settler colonialism? And how can we build a right relationship with this land we have settled on?
All right, thank you, Davis. Rayanne Wentworth and I will be here and available in the chat if you have any questions throughout the evening, and we'll help you. Questions for Deb and Eula can go in the Q&A, and Rayanne and I will moderate those. If you have social chatter, that can also go in the chat on the right. I love that. That can just go in the chat to the side. When they are done, we will promote members of the Hampshire community to panelists, so you can see each other and say hello to Deb and Eula and each other. So stick around if you are a Hampshire alum, faculty, staff, student, and we will let you in. We will be recording this event until that time, and then we'll cut the recording then. And then, led by Amy Drayansky, there'll be a student poetry and prose reading shortly after 9, after we finish those brief hellos. And so I encourage Hampshire community members to stay on and enjoy the reading from the students. That'll just go till 9:30 or so. With that, I'm going to turn it over to President Ed Wingenbach. Ed?
Thanks everyone for coming tonight. It's wonderful to have you here. This has been a fabulous way to begin to celebrate Hampshire's 50th anniversary. It doesn't substitute for the in-person gathering that we should have had last month, but fingers crossed we'll have that next year, and we'll have the added benefit of having this series of talks from our really extraordinary alums. It's my pleasure to introduce Emerita Senior Faculty Associate Deb Gorlin. Deb is the author of 2 poetry collections, Life of the Garment, which won the May Sarton New Hampshire Poetry Prize in 2015, and Bodily Course, winner of the White Pine Poetry Press Prize. Her poetry and nonfiction has been published extensively, and she is the poetry editor at the Massachusetts Review. Many of you likely know Deb as a mentor, a teacher, and a writing instructor. She recently retired as the co-director of the writing program after more than 25 years. One of the many Hampshire writers whose education was shaped by Deb over the years is our guest tonight, Eula Biss. Thank you, Deb, for joining us tonight and letting us listen in as you continue this conversation about prose and poetry that you started on campus years ago. Deb?
Thank you, Ed. That was wonderful. So now it's my turn to introduce Eula, and I have a few things to say. Hi, everybody. Here are some facts about Eula's accomplishments. She's a Hampshire alum, 1995 fall, and was the 1999 student commencement speaker. She's a brand new book out, Having and Being Had, in which she examines our assumptions about class, property, capitalism, and her own adult life, which, as she says, quote, is divided between the time before I owned a washing machine and the time after, end of quote. Her book on immunity and inoculation was named one of the 10 best books of 2014 by the New York Times and other major publications, and was also nominated for a National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism. Her second book, Notes from No Man's Land, won the award in 2009. Her sequence of prose poems that reflect upon the difficulties of love and longtime commitment, The Balloonists, evolved from her Division III. A Guggenheim recipient with fellowships from the Howard Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts, she currently teaches nonfiction writing at Northwestern University. Okay, facts done. Here's what I think. Eula Biss, I'm not done yet. She's been called a lyrical epistemologist of dread. She's viewed by many as Joan Didion's heiress apparent. As compared to an imperious Susan Sontag, she's been described as, quote, stealthy, a writer who advances from all sides like a chess player. One of her editors classifies her as a citizen thinker and notes her bravery as someone who is not afraid to confront topics that she most thinks she's not qualified to write about. Here's another. A specialist at handling our twitchiest, most combustible of metaphors. I love that word, twitchy. For me, Eula is a vital exemplar of Henry James' exhortation to writers, someone on whom nothing is lost. Her writing originates, heart and soul and body, with her lived experience, this very life of hers. Bottom line, her inquiries, aspirations, inspirations, anxieties, troubles always start with the subject matter that is currently front and center in her life. To quote Eula, quoting Rilke's advice to writers, you must, quote, live the question, end of quote. To which Eula adds, quote, this, my mother reminds me, is as essential to mothering as it is to poetry, end of quote. Every bit, morsel, scrap of her life has been used within her own bubbling compost. That word compost coming from Middle English, meaning putting things together, such as manure, fallen leaves for fertilizer. And of course, the etymological root for another English word for the essay, a composition. In Eula's work, all of it seeds and grows her remarkable writing, whether it be about her own body, visceral details about her experience with childbirth, her parents, her love affairs, her racial identity, and complicity with whiteness, and now in her recent book, Having and Being Had, with capitalism, as she takes a deep dive, in spite of her shame, to break the cultural taboo of talking about money and reveal her salary in all its numerical nakedness and the ways a middle-class existence troubles her values. It's her intense, emotional, and artistic passion that won't be satisfied with only memoir, only narrative, only personal essay, only poetry, but must perforce stretch out and seek many more ways of situating herself in the layered world of ideas, in stacked contexts and the multiple ways of knowing lodged in literature, philosophy, etymology, mythology, political theory, history, science, biology, immunology, sociology, biography, whatever she needs to know. She takes them all on with a combination of curiosity, earnestness, skepticism, humor. In essence, Eula is an incessant learner, a student, not a scholar, a seeker, not a researcher. On a quest, she's not out for the holy grail of truths or answers, but for insights, understandings, revelations, inconclusive as they must be. Eula has said that she writes ultimately to argue with herself on the page. And I can't help thinking of another quote, William Butler Yeats's famous words that, quote, out of the quarrel with others, we make rhetoric. Out of the quarrel with ourselves, we make poetry. And so, here we are together 21 odd years later to talk about the putative beginnings in an independent study at ye old Hampshire College, the origin story of a writing career that unleashed a new hybrid literary form, a mashup of genres, poetry and prose, at the time a subversive, mixed, wild, indefinable piece of writing known as the lyric essay, or whatever you want to call it. I knew her as a highly promising writing student, as Eula Biss, the last name so easily confused with bliss, but the first name a bit antiquated, southern sounding, and apparently fairly common in the early 1900s. But by the 90s, lost in a sea of Jennifers, Amy's, Melissas, it was unique as she was. The name Eula has its roots in Greek and means well or sweet spoken. I'll be quiet now. Let's hear it from Eulalian Eula.
Oh, thank you, Deb. That was incredibly generous. Of course, you've been the most generous of all instructors and mentors ever. But I really want to credit you with putting the compost back in composition. I did not know that.
Well, you and I in etymology, we go way back. And
I love it. I had no idea.
Yep.
But that it like totally changes the texture of the word composition for me to know that compost lives in there.
Yeah.
Of course, it takes a poet to see that.
Well,
so I'll say, 22 years ago, circa 1998, Deb and I are fairly certain of the date. I approached Deb asking her if she would do an independent study with me. It had come to my attention that I didn't know that much about grammar. Deb was not the person who brought this to my attention, but and at that point I knew I wanted to pursue writing in some sort of serious way. And I thought, well, if I'm going to be serious as a writer, I better learn this equipment. So I came to Deb in the Writing Center and said, will you please teach me grammar? And Deb said, oh, honey, I can teach you grammar, but you don't want to do that. and she assured me that I would pick up grammar along the way through reading, as I have. And Deb said, why don't we do something more interesting? Why don't we do an independent study on something that's really going to feed you as a writer? And she said, I don't know what that is, but what do you really want to know more about? And so this is when I think together we hatched this plan to read works that fell somewhere in between poetry and prose together, to do an independent study on prose poetry. I had really only very recently discovered that prose poetry existed. And I think that's about all I knew when I came to you, Deb. I think I knew that prose poetry existed, and I'd read like one Russell Edison piece.
But you weren't writing the balloonists yet, so you were still writing lineated poems.
Yeah, I was. I think I was. Yeah.
And when you wrote the balloonists, which
the next year,
a sequence of prose poems, right?
Yeah. And you continued to mentor me. I continued to meet with you through writing the balloonists. So I think that's why this runs together in our minds.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, the books, we talked about this before. The books that we chose turned out to be remarkably prescient, and every one of the authors, maybe with the exception of DJ, who went on to become much more of a cultural historian than a literary figure, but they all went on to do really remarkable, inventive work. And that was the beginning of it. And you asked me, how did I come up with these books? And I felt like, well, I answered you somewhat facetiously, and I said, well, I kind of, picked them out of the air, but they were in the air. You know,
Yeah.
it wasn't something that was so arbitrary. They were in the air. There was a lot of excitement going on. I had been in a graduate program with many people who became well-known prose poets, Killarney Clary, Gary Young. So there was that resource, and then DJ Waldy, the book that we're going to talk about, Holy Land, happened to be a really dear friend of my husband's in California, and actually gave us, some money to put a down payment on our house in Amherst in 1991. So,
Wow.
and his book had just come out, and it was remarkable. And Ann Carson was up and coming, and Hilton Als. I don't think that was, as far as I remember, he was not writing for the New Yorker at that point, or maybe he was, but you know, there was a lot of life going on in all of those hybrid kinds of genres, innovative forms.
And I should say, all these books that you brought to me these authors were all new to me. But these books have been so foundational for me.
Mhm.
This is part of the great debt that I owe you, Deb, is that these books are books that I've returned to again and again. They're books that I teach. They're books that when I run into trouble in my writing, that I return to and reread. I look through them for clues on how to solve problems. And so I'll just say for the audience that the handful of books that we recovered from this reading list were Holy Land by DJ Waldy, Autobiography of Red by Ann Carson, The Collected Works of Billy the Kid by Michael Ondaatje, and The Women by Hilton Als. And there were probably a couple others as well that we can't recall. And then we also read a great anthology of the prose poem called Models of the Universe. It's an international anthology of the prose poem.
Okay, that was the one. Okay.
Yeah, that was the one anthology that was in there. And these others were complete works that weren't collections of prose poems. They were book length works. Should we dive into Holy Land, Deb? Should we just go ahead?
Dive into Holy Land, and I want to know, how you see it as foundational, how you see it as kind of, I remember you saying at one point, these people, all of these writers are your family, they're your people, that there's this ancestral connection, family that you didn't even know you had, but were there. So, dive into DJ. Who I know is gone. It's hard for me to call him DJ, but it's okay. I'll manage.
I think that was part of the incredible sense of discovery that I had in this independent study, was the sense that, I've found the people that I belong among as a writer, or the place where I belong aesthetically. And the book where I felt that the most was probably Holy Land. And it really is, Holy Land is the closest to, at least my most recent work, Having and Being Had, is probably closest in structure to Holy Land. So this book by DJ Waldy it's a history of one of the first suburbs in the United States. And it's also a memoir of life in that suburb. And it's written in short, mostly less than one page blocks of prose that are numbered. And it's non-narrative for the most part, though there's a light narrative of a life that progresses, but it's not driven by narrative, and it's non-linear. I think there's a little bit of movement around in time. And I think one of the things that I really learned from was the movement between these blocks of prose, these sections, was quite associative. So there were big gaps between these moments. Sometimes there wasn't. So there would be a run of sections that would be about the history of this suburb. But then you'd arrive in a scene from childhood, or you'd arrive in somewhere else than where you'd been the moment before. And so this book the form allows for these leaps. And I was very attracted to that. I think it's already the way my mind works, but it was really exciting for me to see a writer working in a form that allows for leaps of association and allows for silences and omissions. There's substantial silences and omissions in this particular book. And there's, I think, an exciting amount of room for interpretation, Deb. I remember you telling me, that DJ Waldy really saw this as like a love letter to the suburbs. And for years, I gave this book out to everyone I knew. I gave it to my father, my stepmother, my best friend. Everyone got a copy of Holy Land. And there were wildly different interpretations of this book from different people, but there were definitely some people who saw it as a fairly harsh critique of the suburbs.
And the irony, Eula, is that it's at least according to Don, it is the absolute reverse of that. It's the opposite of that. What he was trying to do was defend the suburbs, and he felt very passionate that he wanted to somehow speak to the contempt, this sort of knee-jerk contempt that people have for the suburbs. And Holy Land, the title is not ironic, which is something that if you read it, I think, a number of times, I don't think you have to know Don, but I think if you read it a number of times, you can see that he is making this argument. It is oblique. It is subterranean. It is sort of, enmeshed in all of these, these fragments that are actually designed to mimic the conformity and the cookie cutter, design of Lakewood, the town where he grew up itself. So, it's tricky business, but it's not, I think it would be more apparent. I think the interpretations would not be so varied if he had written simply, an essay in which he says, his thesis statement, I love Lakewood, love it or leave it. But he doesn't do that.
Yeah. And that's something that's remained kind of, I don't know, I think comforting to me as a writer, especially when I see my own work interpreted in ways that feel wildly off my intention. Is I feel like with Holy Land, I feel like that room for interpretation is a feature, not a bug. I feel like that's what I love about the book is you as a reader complete it, and you do have to be a very attentive reader to see that argument that he's making develop in full. And you might need to even put the blinders on some of your own assumptions around the suburbs or your own experience within the suburbs. And
Absolutely.
And I think I love that room. I want that as a reader. And so whenever I get frustrated about, seeing that people have, to my mind, misinterpreted something I've written, I think, well, but I want that room as a reader. And so as a writer, I want to leave that room for readers like me who want that room for interpretation, who want to do that work.
That's, talk about generous.
Right.
If you were an academic, I don't think you'd, feel the same.
And even as a non-academic, I have my doubts, really. Now that I know what it feels like.
Also, I feel like what he was doing was creative nonfiction.
Yeah.
So as if you want to look at Autobiography of Red, which is fundamentally, a narrative, Don was really writing about history and architecture and California life and problems with water, problems with oil, the California culture. So in some ways, he's switched to becoming more a cultural historian than somebody who's a literary, or a lyric essayist. makes sense, because you can see all of that in that book. And that's really what he's gone on to do.
And that's part of what was so exciting to me about that book, though. What was it? It felt like poetry. It moved with some of the logic of poetry,
Right.
but it was full of information. It's very information dense, and especially maybe the first third or so. There's a lot of information. He's really dedicated to the project of conserving and communicating the history of this particular place, and he goes into fairly deep detail about how the place was planned, how it was built, all the context for it. And I think I was also just thrilled to see someone doing both things, being using the logic of poetry, but also using a lot of information too. It's and so balancing the demands of informing a reader and working with information against the associative logic and the like propensity for metaphor of the poem too. So the book also feels loaded with metaphor to me. And
well, and what's interesting, when I reread it, I hadn't read it in a while, what I realized, and I would say this in a number of works, that the information, the exposition in itself becomes metaphor. That there's a way in which it's no longer just these inert facts, but in the explanation, you see that there are other meanings that are being conveyed through just the simple these simple, seemingly, by themselves, inert kinds of, almost a ton facts. So that in itself, that cross fertilization, is just fascinating.
Yeah. And then, Autobiography of Red, a totally different book, but also hovering between prose and poetry or borrowing on techniques that are common to poetry and techniques that are common to prose. It's very narrative. It's got a storyline that's driving it. It's written, the subtitle is A Novel in Verse, and I saw a review that said it's not really a novel and it's not really in verse.
and then on top of that, you have autobiography. So you have all of these terms that sort of cancel each other out.
Yes.
I think part of the joke. It's part of Carson's.
Totally. And it's, I think, part of Anne Carson's stance towards category and genre in general. I was immediately drawn to that stance. I love it. It's a contrarian stance. It's I'll call this thing verse, all the things you're not supposed to do in verse, or I'll call this thing an essay and I'll lineate it. That's like, she's consistently acting out within the bounds of genre or whatever category she's playing with. This was my introduction to Anne Carson. She wasn't famous yet when you sent me towards this book. Not that I know of. She was actually so unfamous that, a year later after I graduated, I saw her read in a Brooklyn public library, and there were like 7 people in the audience. It was definitely not, as compared to recently, she was down at the University of Chicago, and, it was in an immense auditorium with like, 1,500 people or something. But it was nothing like that. It was, just a smattering of people who wandered in off the street when I saw her then. But this really, reading Autobiography of Red, I loved it, but it also just sent me to Anne Carson. And I read everything that she wrote for the next many years, probably like 15 years. I read every book as it came out. And those books were, all of them, incredibly important to me. This book, I don't think.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Finish. Well, I think is she's able to take her knowledge of the classics. I mean, this is a woman who has a PhD in classics, and who is by all rights a scholar, and integrate that knowledge into whatever she may be doing. And so, what I loved about autobiography of Red was the combination of the of classics with modernity. I mean, seemingly anachronistic, but you've got classical Greek mythology that is on the same page as these queer lovers, Hercules and Geryon, who's a monster with red wings. So you've got this fantasy, you've got this mythology, and then in the middle of it, she'll throw in some quote from Kant or from Emily Dickinson, and it all somehow works. And I would also say, I mean, maybe this is crazy, but I read autobiography of Red like I would read a kind of bodice ripper. I mean, there is this way in which its sensuality, its viscerality. I mean, it was just a thrilling. What do they say now? I hear this word often, propulsive, but it did feel like a very exciting read, and you just think, whoa, how does she do this?
Yeah, because it doesn't make sense. And I associate this kind of high concept work with being feeling like distant or cold or something. And this book is none of those things. It's so intimate and it's so warm. And you're right, it is like right up very close to being a bodice ripper, but like totally reimagined.
It's totally sexy. I mean, it's not porn.
Yeah, totally.
But it's incredibly sexy, and you do feel kind of voyeuristic, reading it.
Yeah.
So
totally.
What did you get in? I mean,
and did we ever? The summary that I had written down for this book is that it's about a love affair between Geryon, which you mentioned already, who's both a boy and a red monster, and Hercules, who we know from Greek mythology that Hercules, during one of his tasks, he actually, his task isn't even to kill Geryon, he just kills Geryon on his way to finishing his 10th task. It's like Geryon's just like a side note. And the idea in this work is that she inhabits this minor character from Greek mythology and writes from his point of view, but puts him in a love affair with the person who's.
But it's also based on some fragment. Again, this is so arcane. I mean, I can't. Yeah. It's also based on a fragment that she translated by some Greek poet named Stesichorus, and she didn't make him up. I know he exists, but just that kind of playfulness and license and kind of liberty. Like, I can have fun. I can have fun. I can, I can mash up. I can, spin around. I can, upend.
And it's such an interesting. Yeah, it's like a frame that goes around this very like sexy and intimate and tender book. It's framed by these notes on either end that are about this Greek poet. That I think the first time I read it, Deb, when I was reading it with you 20 years ago, I didn't know enough about. I think I didn't know enough about academic or scholarly writing to see what fun she's having in that beginning. I was confused by those portions of the book because I didn't know the conventions that she was playing with. Now, when I returned to it right before this talk, I was like finding it hilarious, but I didn't at 20. And I remember I thought that the book would be perfect if she could just cut off the beginning and the end where she, did that stuff I didn't understand.
Tell the story, get that.
Just get to the story and the sexy part. Yeah. But I remember I asked her, I was at that reading where there was like 7 people in Brooklyn. I said, why did you do that? Why did you put this at the beginning and at the end? And I said, why did you do this kind of academic thing on a book that feels so otherwise so vulnerable and of a different texture? And she said, she's as oblique in person as she is on the page. And she said, I love the company of academics, and I wanted to give this book a little company. So she gave it some academic-ish playful writing to be its companion. It's it wasn't much of an answer, but you know.
But you know, she's entitled, I suppose.
Yes, yes. So Deb, I'm actually not sure, since we got started late, I'm not entirely sure what to do about our time situation.
Yeah.
Um,
Karen, have any ideas about that?
Yeah, I think we have asked folks to put questions in the Q&A. We just put that in the chat, and
Okay.
no questions have shown up yet. So let's give
Okay.
people a moment, see if they've got some burning questions. The two of you
One of the
could
things I want
continue
to
talking.
talk about before we stop, I just want to, I have one important thing to say, and that's, I want to talk about my new work, and I want to talk about Eula's new work. And Eula, you go first, and then I want to talk about mine just a little bit. I promise.
yeah, and you don't have to rush that, Deb. It's okay. It's I think that this, like you said, this was that we were going to work up to this payoff. So don't rush your payoff.
Okay. This is like,
And I think, you know, one of the great revelations of this this collaboration to me is that, you know, after all this time, me working from these books that you gave me 20 years ago, now you're writing a book that is something like this. You were writing as a poet who was writing lineated poems when I studied with you and for years after. But
I
you,
got on your case. I got on your case in the Balloonists when you were, you know, inserting all of this expository material about boat building and
yes.
kite flying and I said, why are you doing this? And you know, little by little, by the end of that year of your Div 3, you had me convinced that, you know, it could work, but it still felt kind of unruly. It felt a little bit, you know, a blasphemous, maybe that's too strong, but the transgressive. And I, you know, I grew up in a time where poetry had to be lineated, it had to be musical, it didn't have to be rhymed necessarily or cadence, but there was a sense in which poetry and prose, you know, or poetry and fiction were very separate and segregated entities. And what's happened in the last 2 years for me is that I have started to write what I would only I can only call a lyric essay, and it's because of your influence. And you, when I mentioned that I was planning on writing something that would touch upon postpartum depression, pumpkins, and my son's work as a seed analyst for, you know, an organic seed company in Maine, you didn't bat an eye. I mean, you never. It was like, oh, sure, all those things go together.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I thought, well, you know, if Eula thinks they can go together, then maybe there's something to it. And what's happened is what I'm finding absolutely liberating and exhilarating is that it's starting with that premise, if you will, has opened up this whole world where I'm writing not just about postpartum depression, I'm not writing not just about my son's work, I'm writing about pumpkins in folklore, I'm writing about climate change and the earth, I'm writing about myth, I'm writing about botany, and you know, there's this kind of wild, but really, it seems to me ultimately coherent, or there's a wild coherence to it, and I haven't quite figured out where it's going exactly, but it's starting to feel like, you know, things are clicking. There's a structure evolving, and the different segments are talking to each other. And I have you to thank for that.
I
You
think
know,
you might be over
like,
crediting me, but it sounds tremendously exciting to me. And I know I recognize this stage of the process where where it feels chaotic and like you said, and you have to work from an intuition that there's a relationship between these different subjects, or and I think for me a lot of the work is then you moving from intuition to a more like a intellectual or intentional place where I have to find exactly on the page. So what is the relationship? What is this doing here? And I feel like sometimes it takes me the whole work to answer those questions, like,
But in some ways I feel like that's what happens when I'm writing a single poem. It's just much, it's a much shorter process, and it doesn't involve all of these, moving parts. But essentially, if I started out, I read somewhere that Yeats would write a kind of thesis statement at the top of the page for what his poem was going to be about. In some ways that makes sense, because so much of his poetry it has ideas in it. But to do that, and then then to proceed to write a poem, just seems to me like an absolutely alien process. And so I'm used to surprise. That's what I feel is fundamental in writing, is that surprise. Oh, that's why I'm writing this, or that's what this is about. But on this scale, it's much, much bigger. And that's something that I find remarkably stimulating and exciting. So
yeah, I find it thrilling too, and intimidating too. It's especially when you spend maybe years in that place of chaos
and fear. I mean, but it seems to me that why write if you're not in some ways afraid of what you're going to find out, or that's a measure of how important it is that you do it. And this is a subject, the depression and motherhood and all of that. It was a subject that I realized. And I remember having this revelation, maybe 20, 25 years ago, that as a self, I am not somebody who is necessarily influenced or shaped only by, the family unit or family pathology, that there are all of these influences that are cultural, that are historical, that are biological, that are environmental, and that awareness of all of these contingencies and causations is again liberating and complicating in ways that seem to me to be fundamentally very healthy and very true. There's no answer. You can't reduce it. You can't you can't simplify it.
Yes. Yes. I know that Karen is here waiting to give us questions.
I'm waiting patiently. There are lots of questions showing up in the Q&A now. The first one I see is have you ever worked with music or musicians?
Deb, have you ever worked with music or musicians?
I have never. I love music, and I have a daughter who's a fabulous musician, but I've never worked with musicians. How about you, Eula?
Musicians have been part of my community for a long time, especially when I lived in San Diego. I had trouble locating the writers when I got to San Diego, but I found the musicians. And so I've had a lot of conversation with musicians, and I borrow on ideas from music, but I don't know the first thing really about it. I don't have any of practice as a musician. It's this most recent book that I having and being had was actually in my mind. It has a structure that's a fugue structure. But I don't know if that's really true. I mean, it's my understanding of what a fugue is, explained to me by a musician. And I'm sure I probably worked some distortions on that in translating both my understanding, but also translating my understanding to the page. But I saw it as a book that had many, I think in music you would call it a theme, and the book had many themes, and I was dropping them in one by one. And until, it reached a kind of point where they're layered on top of each other. and then, you know, drop them out again. So there's a kind of symmetry in my mind to the structure of the book.
And I remember you wanting to know what a sonata was. This
Oh
was
yeah,
ages ago. Remember that?
that's true.
And,
Yes,
and
yes, yes,
sonata, but
and
you
that's
want
true.
you
In the
want to know
balloonist,
it.
I was working with that idea of what a sonata is, which is, yeah, like a more two voices, but a
In
sounding
contrast.
together. Yes, yes, alternating, yeah. So those ideas have always been really exciting, formally very exciting to me, though I'm sure I bastardized them, you know, it's, but
Oh, license, poetic license, right?
yes. What else, Karen?
The next question, Eula, how has it been for you to have vaccination in the news every day lately? And have you wanted to return to some of your work from On Immunity?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I have absolutely not wanted to return to my work from On Immunity. It's been, that actually is a book that I would love to see made obsolete. You know, I would love for us to not need to be talking about the subject matter of that book. And it doesn't upset me that we're still talking about it, but I have realized something about myself as I get, you know, all these invitations come now for me to talk about that book or talk about vaccination to various different kinds of audiences. And I think that one of the things I like as a thinker and as a writer is to have the illusion that I'm working in a space where like other people aren't looking, like you all are talking about that, and so I'm going to talk about this. And I think that that's I think that I do better and more interesting thinking when I believe that I'm kind of in the margins. And so there's something in me that freezes up a little bit when I feel like everybody's looking at the subject matter. And so that's why I have like zero desire. I've gotten all these invitations to essentially write On Immunity again. And I just feel like, oh, I did that book. It's out there, it's available, you can read it.
Are there parameters that help you define the shape of your work? How do you know when you've gone outside the bounds?
That's interesting. Deb, are you discovering this in your new project? Are you setting or finding parameters?
Yeah. And the parameter right now is fairly vague, and it feels intuitive and almost on the level of sensation. If I feel like there's something I'm repeating, whether it's a kind of rhythmic repetition or even a repetition that has some kind of content or ideas, I'll cut it out. I'll say I don't need this, and that's sort of my style as a revisionist anyway, which is that I have to expand before I can contract. I need to say things in many ways before I find, the right tone, the right proportion, the right scale. And so, I don't have any, and the other criterion is if I'm bored. If I sort of sneak up on it after a while and I think, oh, this is really boring, then I'll keep it, because sometimes it can be, I can think something's boring because I'm in a bad mood, and I can come back to it a day later and think, oh God, this is really good. So I wait. I try to be as measured as I can, but it's never really done.
Yeah.
It's never really done. It's just it's like Beckett's saying, you sort of fail better each time.
Yeah, I think that the idea of a parameter or formal limitations is something that I have borrowed from poetry in my prose writing, and that I'm drawn to, but it's there isn't, in the space where I'm writing, there isn't as much received form. I feel like I most often need to feel my way into the parameters. And with this most recent book, Having and Being Had, I did really feel my way in. I started writing without any parameters or rules, just watching what was happening. And I then made a lot of rules for myself, maybe more than any other work I made rules. But almost all the rules were based on something that I already saw happening. And so I'd written a bit of the book, and I saw, okay, it's emerging that this book is going to be short titled pieces. So there's, one of the parameters is that I've begun doing that, and I'm going to continue doing that. But I also saw that almost all of them began in the present tense. And so that became a rule. Each piece was going to begin in the present tense. I made content rules for myself. One of the most basic rules that kind of shapes the work is I had to talk about money in this book. And I had to talk about money, the economy, ownership, but definitely money in my own life was a rule. And then a secondary rule was that when I talked about money, I had to name specific sums. And all of these, my relationship with all these parameters is usually, at least, until the work is close to done, I don't experience them as limiters. I actually find, and this is how I once experienced a line break, right, Deb? Like, the pressure of a line break driving you into an interesting decision that you wouldn't otherwise make. Like that's how I feel about all these parameters. They don't feel limiting while I'm in process. They feel like they're forcing me into decisions that I wouldn't otherwise make, or forcing me into investigations that I ended up writing some material that I had no intention of putting on the page, but it was the rules of the book pushed me into that material. And then I came to understand, okay, this belongs here. But it is interesting. There's this, I think it's very counterintuitive what the rules and obstructions and parameters and formal limiters can do for a work.
Yeah.
But maybe my internet is getting flaky now. Someone asks, I would love to hear what books are on your nightstands currently, and then we'll shift over.
Yeah. Deb, what are you reading?
Well, I am reading, I just started. I've been through, I'm at that point in my life where if I don't like a book after 25 pages, I just put it down. And it can be well reviewed. I could have liked books by the author, prior books, but I just don't have the time.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to mention the 4 or 5 books that I have returned to the library after, reading only 25, 30 pages, because it would just be mean. But the book that I've just picked up, which I actually really, really like, I'm only 20 pages in, is A Paragon, a novel by Colin McCann. And what it's about is these two, a Palestinian father and an Israeli father, both of whom lose their daughters, and because of violence in Israel and Palestine, and who join a group that is designed to talk about peace and reconciliation and so on. And the story itself is really fascinating, but what Colin McCann has done is essentially written a lyric novel insofar as he's got different braided sections. So there's a section about military equipment. There's another section about birds that migrate in Israel, and then there's the story itself. And there are quotes from Borges and Rumi, and the whole book is organized in about 500 different segments, and it's really interesting, and so it's held my attention. And then I'm reading an anthology of poems of Native American poets that just came out. Joy Harjo, the poet laureate, has collected a huge Norton anthology that's really quite remarkable. And you know,
Oh, that's great. I have like a nightstand crisis, Deb, where it's just like overflowing.
yeah, well,
The overflow has been pushed into a closet, you know, it's some things have slipped under the bed, but right on the top of that total mess is this trilogy books. I think I told you about these books would be very at home in our independent study. It's this trilogy of books by the French essayist Natalie Legere.
yeah.
And the first book is called Exposition, followed by Sweet for Barbara Loden, which is absolutely gorgeous, incredible book. And the last one is called The White Dress. And they're brief lyric essays, all of them, and make an amazing trilogy. It's gorgeous work.
Are they all published by Sylvia Press? Is that
By Dorothy, yeah, that feminist press, yeah.
Sylvia.
Yes, it's
Okay.
Yeah, they're all published by Dorothy, and the first and the last just came out this fall. They published the middle book last year, 2 years, a few years ago. And what else? So the other thing near the top of the pile was I'm catching up on books that I think everyone else read, you know, within the last like several years. But Sarah Broom's The Yellow House, I loved it. It was really, really beautiful, and another like a memoir that's doing all kinds of other work at the same time.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you both so much. Thanks to Ed and to Davis and everyone else who made this evening possible. Eula has felt like an old friend to me because I read her books and she seems familiar. I only knew her in passing when she was a student and I was staff and didn't know Deb, but this was a treat. At this point, I'm going to promote the Hampshire folks to panelists so that we can all see each other. And the students will have their poetry and prose reading. And those of you who are joining us as guests, thanks so much for being here this evening. And we hope we'll see you at another event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.